Representative Grayson, thanks so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Listen, before we get started, just there's a question I've wanted to ask you for a long time, and because it just preys on my mind. You deal every day with representatives in a party who talk absolute nonsense, and sometimes, as we're about to find out, absolute nonsense that hurts people or costs people their lives. And just before we get started, if you don't mind my asking, how do you do it? How do you walk into work every day and deal with the absurdities you have to deal with? What's your secret?
Well, there's an overriding consideration, which is what's at stake. The decisions that we make and the laws that we pass actually are matters of literally life and death for people. And I know that there's 700,000 people in my district who are counting on me to do something good for them in their lives, and many people across the country who feel the same way. A lot of people think that I'm their congressman, even if they live in an entirely different state. So that's how I go into it each day. I don't disagree with anything that you said. They're often, when I talk to members of the other party, I find that their heads are full of nonsense. It's just as bad as you're describing. But the fact is that somehow we have to get good things done for people and to try to move the process forward. So I bite my tongue, and I try to do the best that I can do and try to find things that are constructive to do, even looking at things from their perspective, as long as they're still constructive looking at things from my perspective. Last year, we passed more amendments than any member of the House, Democratic or Republican, and we did it because I gave some thought to what I was hearing from them, as crazy as it may seem, and tried to think of ways that we could move the progressive agenda forward and at the same time give them something that they consider to be valuable. I remember one amendment I came up with, we thought of it as a progressive amendment. Some of them thought of it as a states' rights amendment. It didn't really matter to me that they thought of it that way. We actually designed it to pick up their votes. And that's the kind of things that you can do if you hold your tongue, don't get too personal with them, and try to see what it is that they see in a situation and galvanize it into something useful.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thanks so much. I really have wondered about that from time to time, and now I think from that we'll switch to the tragedy, the case of Charlene Dill, which you've been outspoken about. She was either near or in your area. Is that right? This is the young woman who died as a result of a lack of Medicaid coverage.
Yes, that's right.
So, briefly, the story, just for those of our listeners who don't know it, and you can feel free to elaborate if I've left out an important point. But Charlene Dill was a young woman, 32 years old, I believe, who had been trying for a long time to get health care coverage because she had an ongoing chronic heart condition, and because of some various machinations involving both gaps, her not qualifying for straight Medicaid coverage, and I guess the state of Florida's refusal to accept state funding for the gap coverage, Medicaid coverage. She was unable to obtain health care insurance and tragically died. Have I summarized the case correctly?
Yeah, but to be specific, the Republicans denied care to her. The Republicans in Tallahassee running the state government denied care to her and to almost a million others just like her, even though the care would have cost the taxpayers in Florida nothing.
So now this is an issue I've struggled with before in other states, where you've had a split on the Republican side. Some Republicans have accepted the money. I believe Chris Christie accepted the money. But basically the law provided federal funding to cover people like Charlene Dill. And there are governors like Governor Scott and other Republicans who have turned it down. And, I guess just backtracking to my first question, really, this is what sparked it for me. What rationale is there in the world for turning down money that doesn't cost the government you run anything and that provides something very valuable to nearly 1 million residents of your own state?
Well, one rationale is, of course, sadism. There might be some of them who actually enjoy the thought that people are denied the care that they need in order to stay healthy or alive.
Now, do you really believe that?
I mean, look, you may recall during one of the Republican debates in 2012, when the subject came up, the chants from the audience saying, "Let them die, let them die, let them."
Yeah,
Do you remember that?
I do
Well,
actually. I'd
I
forgotten.
think
Yeah.
sadism is a fair description of that kind of attitude. But beyond that, they're willing to essentially bite your nose to spite their face. They are willing to put up with any sort of pain as long as it's somebody else's. And I suppose their ideology instructs them that if you can't afford health insurance, you shouldn't get it.
Well, you know,
That's
here's the
the
funny
bottom
thing.
line. That's where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think you're. I'm sure you're right, and you know the psychology better than I do. But you know, here's the thing: the tragic death of young mother, 32 years old, Charlene Dill, who is everything that they pretend to praise in a human being, working three jobs, doing everything she can to provide for her children, to get ahead in life. This is like the model of the self-made American that they pretend to admire, but which the rest of us are fighting for, and apparently they're willing to sacrifice.
Well, apparently, in the same way that they feel that undocumented immigrants are undocumented immigrants because they deserve to be, and that the unemployed are unemployed because they deserve to be. Apparently, they think that the sick are sick because they deserve to be. There's a Republican candidate who actually is the Republican nominee against Jan Schakowsky in the state of Illinois who says that autism is a result of God's anger over homosexuality. That if that's your philosophy, then they probably feel like Charlene Dill got exactly what she deserved somehow, in some bizarre moral sense or lack of sense that they have. But you're absolutely right. A single mother working several jobs, leaving behind three orphans, by the way, and one of almost 1 million people who are being denied health care that would cost the taxpayers of Florida nothing. How can you explain it except to say that the Republicans have been blinded by their own ideology? Every single member of the state legislature in Florida has health coverage. Every
Right.
single one of them. And yet they voted to deny that health coverage to almost 1 million other people.
I would only amend your statement, if I might, to say every single member of the Florida legislature has government paid health care, don't they?
That's exactly right. And in this case, what's happened is that up to this point, the limits on Medicaid have been so low that essentially anybody with any job, as a practical matter, likely was excluded from it. Now, what we've done as part of Obamacare is we've taken those 50 million Americans who don't have coverage, and we've divided them up into groups and tried to deal with each group. For instance, people under the age of 26 now can join their parents' policies. And people who had pre-existing conditions now can join existing health care plans they couldn't join before. And one of the largest groups that we had that didn't have health coverage was the working poor, people like Charlene, people who worked and still couldn't afford health coverage. So for those people, what we did is we said, there are 15 million of them in the United States, one-third of all the uninsured who are working poor, just couldn't make enough money to pay for any health coverage at all. We said for those people is that we will expand the existing Medicaid program in order to be able to help them. Because of the Supreme Court's decision, in which they said that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was constitutional, but nevertheless said that states could opt out of this part of it without penalty, because of the Supreme Court's decision, it then became lawful for individual states like Florida to say, no, thank you, we don't want $80 billion from the federal government. And by the way, not only are the people who would have benefited from that money in danger, but our economy is in danger as well. Nurses, doctors, hospitals, people who provide any sort of health care, they're not getting that $80 billion that they would have gotten from the federal government to do their jobs and provide services to the uninsured. They're not getting that money. So not only are they hurting the people who need the care, they're hurting everybody who works for a living in Florida.
They're hurting the entire Florida economy, which is a great point. And by the way, the five justices who voted to strike down that aspect of the law also have government paid health insurance, if I'm not mistaken. And here's another thing about that. Many things about this case upset me and made me angry, but here's one of them. your governor down there in Florida was formerly the head of a company that got a lot of funding out of Medicare, and in fact, the company itself, although not the individual, if I recall correctly, there were some fraud issues there.
He was
So
the
it occurred,
CEO of a company that committed the largest Medicare fraud in history. They stole $1 billion from the government. A
and so he
billion with
was
a
not
B. That's
afraid
1 and
to.
12 zeros.
So
Sorry,
he
1
was
and
not
9 zeros.
afraid to wet his beak, at least indirectly, or somehow manage to profit, at least indirectly, um, from this activity, which, by the way, was funded by the government, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he made $250 million in personal wealth through sucking on the government's teat.
And yet, somehow, this is something he's doing to deny this money on behalf of the citizens of the state of
Well,
Florida.
yes, because his business, up until recently, his business was to own and operate a chain of healthcare clinics, private healthcare clinics, that did not take Medicaid patients. And what he has done since he was elected governor was to initially shut down and zero out the budget for state health clinics, require state employees to get drug tested, which was a tremendous boon for the business he ran, since one of the main services he provided was, in fact, drug testing through his own business, and now to prevent any expansion of Medicaid, to force people into the healthcare chain that he founded and owned and ran.
Well, it reminds me of the Bob Dylan line. He can't help it if he's lucky. So this is do you run into Rick Scott much?
No, I've seen him only once this year.
Oh, okay. Well, so what can people do? I mean, I think that the case of Charlene Dill crystallizes the hideous hypocrisy. And look, I have my criticisms of the Affordable Care Act. I think it can be improved in certain ways and so on. I think we all do. But I mean, this was one of the good features of the law. Outrageously, my assumption is, in addition to the extreme ideology and psychology that you described, that there are also people like Rick Scott doing it for partisan political advantage, that they just would is that fair? I mean, is that
you need to understand that this is not an isolated instance. There was an academic study that showed that in Florida alone, we'd have over 1,000 deaths like Charlene's death every year, as long as this crazy denial of Medicaid continued in effect. 1,000 avoidable deaths every year. Around the country, just in the states where the GOP has decided to prevent the working poor from getting health coverage, the number is over 5,000 every year. And in the country as a whole, before Obamacare went into effect, we had over 40,000 deaths each year because we didn't have these people under health coverage. In fact, if you take two people who are absolutely identical physically, same gender, same age, same smoking habits, same weight, you take two people who are physically identical, one has health coverage, the other one doesn't. In any given year, the one without health coverage is 40% more likely to die. That's what this is all about. In Charlene's case, we can put a face and a name on the death, but those deaths are far more numerous than that.
right? And I think we're talking about, doing the math in my head, 11, 12 people each day dying because of this. So, you've been a great voice on this, but I know people are going to be listening to this and they'll be outraged. And I think the Charlene Dill case humanizes, puts a human face on this condition of the mass statistics that we're talking about. What can people do?
Well, ultimately, what we have to do is to exercise our right to vote. The reason why any of this is possible is because in some of the previous elections, we had Democrats in large numbers decide not to vote. That's what made it possible for the Republicans to take back the House in 2010. When I lost my seat, now I've got it back, but we're still far short of where we were in the House when I was in Congress before. That's what made it possible for Rick Scott to take over state government at the same time as I had to leave Congress in 2010 and to do what the Republicans have done. Florida is, in fact, the ultimate 50-50 state. We happen to have 500,000 more Democrats than Republicans who are registered in Florida, but the problem is we simply don't see enough Democrats who are voting. So the result of that is that we have 17 Florida congressmen who are Republicans versus 10 who are Democrats. We have a Republican governor. Every statewide official other than Senator Nelson is a Republican, and the Republicans outnumber the Democrats in Tallahassee almost 2-1. So, I mean, a very simple answer is let's vote.
Well, absolutely, and to that end, you've been very strong on the messaging, the distinction between Democrats and Republicans. Do you feel that maybe the party as a whole, or other leaders in the party, could be more blunt and more, for lack of a better word, populist in their messaging, or in some way draw a sharper distinction between the two parties than some folks seem inclined to do?
Yes, I do. And I said back in 2010 that we could not let the American people think that the choice back then was between the crazies and the lazies. The crazies in the Republican Party and
Right.
and the lazies in the Democratic Party, who didn't know how to get things done, didn't want to get things done, and basically just wanted to draw a good government salary. And that has been a real problem in the minds of the Democratic constituents now for a long time. We have many Democratic elected officials who seem to accomplish nothing and to stand for nothing. That's a big problem. I think that we're setting an entirely different example. When I tell you that a Democrat passed more amendments in the House of Representatives than any other member of Congress last year, what I'm really telling you is that it's possible to be progressive and to get things done. And that's the standard that we need to hold other Democratic elected officials accountable to.